A whisper, the lingering graze of fingertips, the slip of fabric which offers a fleeting glimpse of what lies underneath, whiffs of promise which stoke the flames of desire, the desire to taste of that fruit which some gods deem forbidden. An ever-expanding universe does not grow by sealing her secrets within impenetrable vaults, but neither can she surrender them so readily to the greedy hands which grope at mystery. She must play the coquette, enticing the mind to explore and invent, to guess and test and tease, to agonize and delight in a tantalizing dance, a pantomime of revelations yet to be revealed. A curious mind is a hungry mind, and such minds are fertile ground for the proliferation of desire. In the mind, desire breeds with itself, multiplying endlessly in orgies of thought. But those who lust for knowledge can neither be sated nor truly denied satisfaction, as in the alluring tug of possibility, we may yet discover an inexhaustible wellspring of pleasure.
Greetings, I'm Kyle Pierce, and I'm going to be continuing with my series on Venus through each of the 12 signs of the zodiac. Now, originally I had planned to do these in order, right? I had planned to do a video on Venus in each of the signs as Venus ingressed into each of the signs. However, Venus in Taurus sort of got away from me. I got a little busy with other projects and things, and now we're already well into Venus in Gemini. And, I wasn't really sure how to proceed for a little bit. If I were to do Venus in Taurus now, I probably wouldn't get to Venus in Gemini until we're already in Venus in Cancer season. So I kind of came to the conclusion that I can do whatever I want because this is my channel, right? So we're just going to jump into Venus in Gemini and, get around to Venus in Taurus when I get to it, right? After all, the point of these videos isn't really about Venus in Gemini and what it's doing, in 2023. My goal with this series is to hopefully leave you with a firm understanding of the essential meaning of Venus in each of the signs, so that you can interpret Venus in your own birth chart, in the chart of somebody else, or whenever it comes to town. So if you want to learn about Venus in Gemini, what it means in a birth chart, as a transit, etc., you came to the right place. So stick around. And while you're at it, like the video, subscribe, all that good stuff. And let's dig in to Venus in Gemini. So a useful general practice when interpreting any planet in any sign is to do a sort of a preliminary scan for what the planet's essential dignity is in the sign that it finds itself in. While there's definitely such a thing as reading too much into essential dignity, it does help sort of establish a baseline relationship between planet and sign. How comfortable is the planet? How naturally compatible is the planet with the sign? How well resourced is it? Does it know what it's doing right off the bat, or does it, need some time to figure things out? Now, Venus rules the signs Taurus and Libra, and then has her exaltation in the sign of Pisces. So we know that Gemini is not any of those signs, so Venus is not any of those kinds of dignified. So, big deal. That will be the case with most signs. Then you want to consider the triplicity layer of dignity, which for Venus is earth and water signs. Earth and water is generally compatible with Venus's nature as a nocturnal planet. Venus oversees, pleasure and love and romance and joy, right? And most of those activities are more compatible with nighttime, right? So Gemini being an air sign, we know that Venus is not in one of her triplicities, right? However, if you look at Venus in any particular chart, you may find that Venus has dignity through being placed in either the bound of Venus in Gemini, or if Venus has a decan. Now, depending on which system of bound rulership you use, you can get some variance in where exactly Venus's bound in Gemini is. Probably the most often used by modern astrologers would be the Egyptian bounds, which places Venus's little slice of heaven between 12 and 17 degrees of Gemini. However, you may, be into the Ptolemaic bounds, which place Venus between 14 and 21 degrees. And then finally, the Chaldean bounds give Venus a bound between 26 and 30 degrees of Gemini. Now, I'll leave that to individuals to decide which system they prefer to use. However, Venus does get a little bit of a boost in the second decan of Gemini, as one of the two major systems of decanic rulership assigns Venus as ruler of the middle 10-degree portion of Gemini. And if you want to know more about what Venus looks like in each of the 3 decans of Gemini, come check out my Patreon after the video. But, outside of those particular areas of Gemini, Venus is considered to be peregrine, which basically just means that the airline lost Venus's luggage, which means that she is going to have to make do with whatever she can find with the help of any other planets that happen to be around, which is not the end of the world, right? It basically just means that Venus is probably going to take a little longer to figure out how to create joy, pleasure, beauty, and harmony, but it's also where you're going to have to look at the dozens of other chart factors. Now, while essential dignity will get our foot in the door and provide a useful baseline for assessing the planet, it doesn't exactly do the work of interpretation for us, does it? There's obviously a lot more nuance, and at the end of the day, we're looking at how Venus goes about creating beauty, joy, pleasure, and harmony in the world and in a person's life with Gemini things. So Gemini is a sign obviously associated with communication, right? And has a sort of general curiosity and interest in exploring difference and exploring new. You could say that if Taurus consciousness is kind of the understanding and observation of the world as it is and enjoyment of it, Gemini is the exploration of different ways for things to relate to each other. There's a sort of cross-pollination that happens with Gemini. There's a what happens if quality with Gemini, which kind of comes with that curiosity. So when Venus is in Gemini, there's a taking pleasure in, enjoying of, and finding beauty in ideas and conversation, the realm of the intellect. So people with Venus and Gemini tend to seek out and enjoy stimulating conversation. And they're attracted to people who have interesting things to talk about, right? Interesting can mean a lot of different things to different people. However, Gemini has that sort of curiosity about all of it and wants to be exposed to different ideas, different perspectives, different ways of doing things and seeing things and understanding things. So, Venus can get down on that, right? Venus is social. Venus is interested in others and creating exchange. And there's actually quite a bit of overlap or just similarity with Venus in Libra, where there's also an interest in conversation and exchange, exchanging ideas, an interest in what's going on with the other and, relating to the self. But there is probably a key point of difference in the way that Venus in Libra is more focused on fairness and equanimity. It's not always looking for agreement. In fact, it will readily disagree if it will correct an imbalance of some kind. In fact, you'll see Venus in Gemini and Venus in Libra will both do a devil's advocate thing sometimes. But Venus in Gemini is not on its own focused on things like fairness. A person with Venus in Gemini might, particularly with the aid of other placements perhaps, but Gemini is a bit more of you could say objective sign where you can sometimes get a kind of amoral quality. And, while Venus is going to tend to be a do-gooder, it's a benefic planet. So usually trying to operate with respect to others and to the general enjoyment of at least themselves, but usually others as well. But Venus and Gemini will want to try on different perspectives to some degree, while Venus and Libra will tend to be a little more, will take offense. I don't know, it's Venus in Libra knows what it is. It's Venus with all of her Venusian powers, and she has a more refined taste. Venus and Libra people tend to figure out what they do and don't like pretty quickly, and will kind of go ugh at stuff they don't, And people with Venus and Gemini will go through that process, but there's a little more of a disinclination towards taking offense, which could be kind of nice. But it can also get people with Venus and Gemini into different and sometimes potentially problematic situations. Venus's good-bad compass isn't quite as well tuned in Gemini, which makes her sort of down to try anything, at least once. People with Venus and Gemini tend to be pretty easygoing and along for the ride as long as it's fun, or if they think they'll learn something out of it. Because Venus and Gemini loves to learn. You'll see people with Venus and Gemini sort of trying to cultivate a kind of eclectic taste and sensibility and capacity to engage in intellectual discourse. They like smart people, and they like to come across as intelligent themselves. They like people who are clever, who are witty, who are funny, and often who are different than themselves. And there tends to be a sort of exploration of who they are, who they might be, through getting involved with maybe different groups of people, different types of people. Who am I when I hang out with these people? Who am I when I hang out with this group? And there's usually an ability to kind of float in between different social circles. And one of the ways that I like to think about Gemini as a sign is there's a sort of adolescent quality to Gemini. That's not to say immature, but as a sort of framework and way of engaging with the world, it's helpful to think of a child between the ages of, say, 5, 6 to 12. Particularly maybe the way that adolescent boys tend to be socialized, at least, until the age of helicopter parents. Kids and boys in particular were sort of allowed to kind of run free, explore the world, get into trouble, right, and sort of bop around the neighborhood. And kids in general are doing that. They're exploring the world, exploring the way that they can engage with it, and who they can be in it. And particularly in Gemini, and just think of your archetypal adolescent boy, there's that what happens if quality, and sort of trying to learn how to do like cool tricks, right? And to sort of just kind of playing with things, playing with whatever's around. And Gemini has that quality, that kind of playful, novel, kind of light way of engaging with the world. In fact, I have found that Venus in Gemini seems to do good things for that period of life. Can make childhood a little extra fun, that sort of adolescent period. Kids with Venus and Gemini around that age tend to have a lot of interests and usually the opportunities to explore them, sort of cultivate different skills and absorb information. However, it's right around that puberty period where it can be a bit of an awkward transition from childhood to teen/young adult, which is a period of life described by Venus in many ways. And often your Venus placement will describe a lot about that part of your life, where you become very interested and invested in what other people think about you, how you relate to others, how you are seen socially, as well as your ability to attract people you're attracted to and figuring out who you are attracted to. You get that, flood of hormones and a whole new set of Venusian desires, are introduced. And it tends to be an uncomfortable transition for most people. Venus in Gemini has a particular quality of, or say that people with Venus in Gemini often have the experience of suddenly realizing that their friends don't want to play tag anymore or play with action figures. Actually, I think about that, if you guys watched Stranger Things, I believe it was Will who sort of runs into that wall where he still wants to play D&D, ride bikes and romp around town, go to the arcade, do all the kid stuff that him and his friends used to do. However, once they're teenagers, right, Mike and Lewis are more interested in girls and like being cool and, popular and stuff. And there's a sort of uncomfortable realization of that, and sometimes an awkward adjustment period where you start to see how maybe Venus and the Mercury-ruled sign of Gemini aren't a perfect match, because there's a sort of a tendency to take a more technical approach to things, or a more mercurial way to approach things like how to get people to like you, which in a lot of ways, I mean, that's a very normal early teenage experience where there's this kind of awkward trying on of different hats, different styles, or different approaches to socializing, but like maybe trying to learn those things by reading a book about it or looking it up online, which can be great, but it can also fill a kid with funny ideas, which maybe take some time to assimilate in a more organic Venusian way. There's a sort of trying to math or trying to engineer themselves or their mode of interaction that, is just inherently awkward at first. You get a lot of think of like a Napoleon Dynamite, where he was talking about trying to develop skills, because skills are what girls are attracted to, right? I just need to impress them with my cool skills or the neat tricks I can do, or by figuring out, how to be clever and funny and witty. And, eventually they figure it out most of the time, but it just tends to be a bit more of a clunky, awkward game of catch up. And, sometimes some embarrassing situations, such as puberty, though. And often you'll see when Venus in Gemini is well placed overall, a really, good ability to make friends, hang out with different groups, like I said, and sort of float around for a while. Gemini is mutable air, so air that moves and changes directions often, sort of spreads and gets around. Venus in Gemini can, for some natives, indicate, getting around, right? Or dating a lot, dating many different people, and an openness to different types of relationships with different types of people. Traditionally, it's Venus in Gemini is associated with bisexuality, which obviously, isn't going to be the case for everyone with Venus in Gemini, but you get that just a willingness to do things differently, be different, or try different, sort of regardless of what may or may not be the moral considerations of the community. But you can see how, under some conditions, it could lead to or facilitate some of that player quality, or that maybe pickup artist quality. Can leave quite a large number of broken hearts in your wake, I suppose. But that's maybe one potential product or result of a general quality that Venus in Gemini has that I believe maybe gives it a leg up, despite, its peregrine status in Gemini. But it's that ability to figure things out. Gemini is a sign that very much describes the cultivation of knowledge on a subject, and the willingness and desire to develop skills, an ability to make things work. So with Venus in Gemini, there's a desire to figure out how to do Venus, and to do Venus well. How to do relationships well, or how to cultivate the skills so that you can be somebody that the people whom you are attracted to may also be attracted to, which could be used in a disingenuous way, in a potentially manipulative way. But, it does tend to be a desirous Venus. It wants many different things, right? It wants to explore and try different stuff, engage in many pleasures, and become skilled in the arts of romance, and cultivate talents in the Venusian space. But, other factors might describe how easy or difficult it is for a person to accomplish that. Venus in Gemini is kind of a nerdy, geeky Venus, a little bit. It's interested in, they read a lot of books. They maybe want to play a lot of video games, for sure. Board games, Dungeons and Dragons, of course. But there's a love of games, and an enjoyment of mental space, which is not always strictly Venusian, or not necessarily off the bat conducive to being conventionally, socially fluent. And sometimes that difficult transition from adolescence to teen can be extended, into adulthood or throughout one's whole life for some, simply because, the person may just be more interested in playing games and doing, non-romantic Gemini activities rather than maybe cultivating a conventional social life. And it's where I maybe want to draw a distinction, because I'm not making a judgment against that. But there is a sort of a character, that maybe many of us know that struggles in social and romantic arenas, maybe finds solace in games and fiction and things like that, which is wonderful and fine. But sometimes, because the language of love, right, doesn't always translate neatly into, the rules of games or the reliability of math, maybe. Or I've seen it play out like there could be a little bit of an unwillingness or an inability to take relationships seriously, or to become frustrated with them and want to give up when the people with whom they're trying to relate with aren't behaving in a rational or perceived to be rational set of rules, maybe. Suffice to say, Venus and Gemini, little geeky, little nerdy, which is, especially now kind of in, so can be experienced as subjectively positive or negative, depending on your environment, I suppose. One thing that Venus will generally describe about a person to one degree or another is like sexual characteristics. If you're a peacock, your feathers are your Venus, right? It's the thing that the qualities and attributes that draw mates, right? Venus and Gemini will tend to describe people who have characteristics or presentation that has qualities of both genders. It can be kind of an androgynous Venus, right? Actually, really good example of Venus and Gemini is Rudolph Valentino. He's an actor in the early 1900s and also a sex symbol. He's a Libra rising with Venus and Gemini. And one of the funny things about Rudolph Valentino is that he was very much adored by women. Female audiences loved Rudolph Valentino. The men did not like Rudolph Valentino, though, because they thought that he represented a sort of a feminization of the manly man. Did not like it, probably especially because their wives did. And he had a complicated love life. There were other factors in his chart, of course. Obviously, that worked for Rudolph Valentino, though, it did limit him from certain roles, right? And made him less appealing to certain audiences. But, that is, it comes to those teenage years, right? Part of the awkwardness can be the not really fitting into a single category, whether that's your sexuality, your sexual identity, your gender identity, or just, the way you look, especially at that age, and comparing oneself to a lot of the images of beauty available in popular media can be experienced as more subjectively challenging for some than others, not necessarily fitting into either side of a gender binary. But I think probably the simplest way to understand it, though, is that Venus in Gemini is interested in the categories and the way other people maybe categorize things like gender. But it's not, committed to fitting into any one of them on its own. That's going to come, the expectation is going to come from like other parts of the chart. Venus in Gemini wants to explore the categories and try them all out if it can. At some point it has to choose between different possibilities, different modes of expression to operate in society in most cases, though there are obviously ways to move between categories. And there are obviously way more than two, which brings me to what I think to be maybe an unfair label that Venus in Gemini often gets assigned, and that is commitment phobic, right? Or unwilling to commit to a monogamous relationship. And I think it is unfair for multiple reasons, but A, there's kind of an assumption that Venus is supposed to be interested in monogamy. Which, newsflash, people, Venus isn't specifically interested in monogamy. Like, that's not Venus's bag necessarily. It's also not Venus's bag. Those are, but that it's not necessarily like strictly Venus's mode of operation. There's nothing about the archetype of Venus that strictly says monogamy. What you can say is that Venus is interested in relationship, mutually beneficial relationship, mutually pleasurable relationship, the giving and receiving of pleasure, and respecting the agreements of relationship, which in many cases are constructed around the idea of monogamy. But stick Venus in Libra in any society, stick it in a society where polygamy is the norm. Venus in Libra's down for that if it works. Venus in Taurus is down for that. It's other planets probably that are going to have the ideas and sort of ego and emotional response maybe to being offended by things that aren't monogamy. So, when I say that Venus in Gemini on its own as a insulated archetype, which it rarely is functioning all by itself, is interested in exploration of different types of being in relationship, and is interested in it being fun and enjoyable. Gemini's it's a lighter sign, which may seem not deep, depending on how you're judging it, but it's kind of an open-ended mode of engaging with the world by nature. So one of the ways that it might show up for somebody in their birth chart is, engaging in polyamorous relationships, or having open relationships, or being, a serial monogamist or polygamist. I don't know. It's on its own as an archetype. It's not a jealous Venus. It's not a possessive Venus. It's Venus that wants to play. Like, it's a fun Venus. It's, a good Venus. But I wouldn't say that there's anything about Venus and Gemini that should lead someone to the assumption that they're going to cheat on you or be unwilling to commit. I haven't found that to be the case. In fact, what it seems to describe is that, there might be a bit of a higher proportion that engage in non-monogamous relationships, but it's usually consensually. But I would say you'll see that more often earlier in life, and I would say they're just as likely to settle down into committed monogamous relationships as anybody else. But Venus in Gemini does get bored easily, right? It wants to keep things fun and fresh, right? And most of the time, it's not going to do that by cheating on their partner. They're going to do it by, keeping things experimental and fun in the bedroom. I don't think it's necessarily something that you should worry about. I think it, often makes a good partner, right? Somebody who is interested in what's going on with you, right? It's air sign. It's also interested in what's going on with them. And it's experimental, right? It wants to see what happens if, right? And find what gets the desired result. And develop techniques and refine them, right? Which can be a quality that is quite applicable to committed relationships, as well as non-committed ones. See, Venus is Gemini is a sign that traditionally has has a strong relationship with technology. In modern astrology, Aquarius often gets credited with being the sign of technology, which there's something there for sure. I do think part of that comes from the modern assignment of Uranus as the ruler of Aquarius, which I don't personally ascribe to, but there is a quality that Aquarius has of like seeing what is, seeing what's wrong with it, and wanting to dreaming up ways to make it better. But traditionally, technology was really considered the realm of Mercury, and you tend to find it more in the signs of Gemini and Virgo. Gemini may be more the inventor and the wanting to try out all the different technologies, while Virgo is maybe more the engineer or the mechanist, the builder of the machine, the refiner of the design, the making sure it works and it's efficient and effective. So you'll see with Venus and Gemini often is an interest in technology, bringing in technology It's a freaky, kinky Venus, you could say. Other parts of the chart may or may not support or make easy and comfortable the kind of free exploration that Venus in Gemini wants to do. But as a planet and a sign, it wants to have fun, right? And it wants you to have fun too, and to keep things evolving and to keep exploring, together, whatever together means. Gemini also corresponds with parts of the body, such as the shoulders. So you'll see people with Venus and Gemini being either drawn to partners with something distinctive about the shoulders, or maybe having something distinctive about their shoulders that is maybe an attractive quality. Maybe they might adorn their shoulders in a special way. I wonder if there's a fondness for capes amongst Venus and Gemini people. I don't know. But, shoulder tattoos, half sleeves, Venus and Gemini territory for sure. Venus and Gemini is also, handsy, likes to touch, likes to explore with their hands, and will probably, want to be touchy-feely and be touchy-feely'd. I'm thinking about the movie Zoolander right now, and David Duchovny had like a little cameo role where he was a hand model, like a older, semi-retired hand model, I think, but he had this big glass case around his hand to like protect it and keep it perfect and beautiful. I'm thinking of God, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. I think it was like Charlie's uncle or cousin or something who had this obsession with his hands and thought that his hands were tiny, but was like focused on how big everybody else's hands were. And then like in one episode, he just had these like giant fake hands were just like really big. He was just like really into hands. Maybe he had Venus and Gemini conjunct Pluto, or I don't know, something. But yeah, might be good with their hands as well in other ways. Like Venus is into making art. You make art with your hands most of the time. So I'm going to assert this claim, if only to contradict maybe some of the bad press that Venus and Gemini seems to get. That is, Venus has a lot to work with in Gemini, and I might even argue can maybe punch above its weight class in terms of peregrine planets, right? For the most part, it's a Venus that you can get to do most of the things that Venus likes to do. There is a tendency to overthink some spheres of Venus, particularly like the romance or the romantic interpersonal nuanced relationship stuff. Venus and Gemini might overthink it a little bit, is maybe a little less ready to do like the less fun stuff of maybe coming to agreement. Its preferred mode of operation is to not take any one thing too seriously. Venus in Libra gives the ability to compromise and to, bring two into union, while Venus in Gemini by default will probably want to say, can't we do both? Or possibly not feel like there's a need to agree, or the fundamental nature of Gemini is focused on contrariety, on duality, on difference. It starts as a binary, multiplies and becomes 4, and then 8, and then 16, and possibilities. They're endless. And the nature of desire, which is Venus, it when in Gemini tends to go like Gemini, right? It tends to multiply like that, which can be a lot of fun, but not sustainable or actually possible to achieve. But it is generally more comfortable with sitting with duality. Gemini is not inherently pulling apart and separating. It's just multiplying and coexisting with the contrarieties and dualities, which is not harmony per se, but it's a sign where, it's Mercury's sign. So you get a bunch of stuff to play with and tinker with and organize in different ways and innovate and come up with, clever ways of doing things or seeing things. And, Venus does a version of that in her signs. She isn't necessarily trying to bring, exact copies of things into relationship. She wants to bring different but harmonious into relationship. So there's a lot of that to work with in Gemini. And it is the different stages and ways of engaging with and encountering the multiplication of possibility in choosing between alternatives. That is the main subject of the difference between Venus and each of the 3 decans of Gemini. And if you would like to learn even more, get into more detail of the different permutations of Venus and Gemini, you can find a link to my Patreon in the description below. And let's see, depending on how things unfold, over the next month or so, next few weeks, there's a good chance that I won't get to Venus and Taurus before getting to Venus and Cancer. Sorry, Venus and Taurus. I hope you don't feel neglected, but don't worry about it. You can rest assured that you're a strong-ass Venus, and we'll get into how awesome you are probably either after Venus and Cancer, or, we're going to have Venus and Leo for several months during the retrograde, so that'll be a good time to catch up, maybe. If you are interested in learning about the decans in general, we would love for you to join us at the 3 of Wands Discord server, where we have decan chats, which occur roughly 3 Tuesday evenings a month, where we discuss the meaning and associated images of whichever decan the sun happens to be in. Check the description. You can find a link to the 3 of Wands Discord server, which is totally free. But if you would like to help support the channel, please consider leaving a donation at my Ko-Fi page or checking out the Patreon. You can also book a reading with me through my website, KylePierceAstrologer.com, or the easiest way to support the channel, hit the like button, subscribe, share with your friends, post on social media, spread the gospel. And thank you so much for watching, for listening, however you're taking it in, and look forward to seeing you next time.